I mean, he always tells his students that, you want to be, one in a million and not one of a million. And it's a really good line. And I hear my students talk about it because something about it resonates. And I think you're looking for things in a film or an interview. You're looking for things that resonate and that can be helpful to folks.
Welcome to Tools for Tech Leaders, where we delve into strategies and ideas for accelerating the success of leaders in the fast-changing technology industry. Today, we're excited to have Bill Guttentag with us, Oscar, Emmy, and Peabody-winning filmmaker and educator whose work in documentary film and leadership education at Stanford Business School is highly regarded. Bill's insight into the art of interviewing and storytelling are invaluable, especially in those leadership roles. My name is Ian Tian, and I'm CEO and co-founder of Mattermost, a self-sovereign collaboration platform for defense, government, and critical infrastructure enterprises, which is sponsoring today's podcast. Bill was one of my professors in graduate school. I learned a lot from him then, and I'm excited to have you meet him today. Bill, welcome to this podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, Ian.
Yeah, thanks. So, learned a lot from you. I'd love maybe we could start with just learning a little bit about your journey in documentary filmmaking and teaching it at Stanford. Could you just share a little bit about that journey?
Well, I had been making documentaries for a while, and then I came to Stanford on what's called a John S. Knight Journalism Fellowship. And it's a chance to, sort of take a year off from your usual job and take classes around the university. And while I was there, I met just an amazing Stanford professor, Rod Kramer. And to state the obvious, Stanford is a first-rate university in just countless ways, but it was a little weak on teaching about entertainment and media. And Rod and I thought, well, maybe we should try to start an entertainment course here. And we did. And it seemed to work and seemed to be relevant. And Rod, who has many interests, including he's a scholar on trust and just an extraordinary teacher, he went off and was teaching about trust in a class which was very popular at Stanford called Lives of Consequence. And I started teaching on my own, and I continued to do so. And I've taught an additional class on my own as well. So that was sort of how I started doing it. And look, the entertainment industry changes a lot. There's certain fields where, you probably don't have to stay as current. But in entertainment, everything changes all the time. And I think Rod found that interesting, and I found it just completely fascinating. One of the class speakers I had, who was the head of a television network, told the story to my students. He said, well, Bill invited me back this year after being here last year. I thought I would dust off my PowerPoint from last year and just basically give a revised version. Well, I looked at the PowerPoint and I realized everything was out of date and it wouldn't do. Well, I don't know that you can say that about a lot of other fields. I mean, certainly the kind of stuff you're doing, it's certainly true. But, this idea that you have to stay contemporary, to keep up is, I find just intellectually challenging and just completely fascinating. So I love doing it, and I continue to like doing it.
Thank you, Bill. That's awesome. I remember when I was in your class, we had Neil Berrien, who was the producer of ER, which is one of my favorite shows. It was such a treat. And I was able to, as a student, organize the logistics. And then, when I realized, my kids, I have to explain, well, what is a television show? Like the fact that it would come on Thursdays, right, is just kind of formed them this kind of world of streaming. Can you, and the entertainment industry, like when I was in your class and then, sometimes I've gotten to visit, the stage is so different. Can you share maybe just a few of the big technology changes that have happened in entertainment, sort of maybe from when you started to kind of now?
Well, basically everything has changed. I mean, one of the really interesting things about teaching this class at Stanford was when I first started teaching the course in 2001, Hollywood and Silicon Valley were pretty distinct. I mean, Silicon Valley was designing and sometimes making the devices, and Hollywood was, making the content. And it was pretty distinct. And but things have really started to change. Google was founded in 1998, Facebook in 2004. The first iPhone didn't come out until 2007. And there was this kind of real separation. Well, the sides are really moving together, and Silicon Valley is just a player in just an enormous way. I mean, Apple won an Oscar, the first Oscar for a streamer for Coda recently. I mean, think about Netflix. Netflix was, for a long time, they were just shipping DVDs through the mail until they came up with, House of Cards. And now, of course, Netflix is a dominant player within the entertainment industry. So there was this real convergence between Silicon Valley and Hollywood that really ramped up as I was teaching and continues to be incredibly important. And I find this to be a really interesting, exciting thing. And it's also, there's sort of, the cultures don't quite mesh, but they really need each other.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's a super interesting point about the cultures, because I think in our personal conversations I've talked about, maybe our family would move to LA at some point, and what's that like? Can you share just a little bit about those two worlds, that Hollywood and that sort of San Francisco Bay Area? Like I think about, like, traffic and food and restaurants, but, like, there's a pretty big cultural difference just on industry. Like, everyone in the Bay Area, I feel like everyone in the Bay Area is doing tech, and everyone in Hollywood, like, has a screenplay idea.
Well, I mean, part of the difference, I think, is that, Hollywood is set up with this idea that, there are enormously talented people doing fantastic things. But there's also, people who are less talented who can get away with it. There's writers who can't write very well, directors who can't direct very well, and so on. In Silicon Valley, to my experience, engineers can code, and if you don't, you probably don't last very long. In Silicon Valley, engineers can code. 450 miles to the south is an industry that literally operates, behind facades and is celebrating the Kardashians. I mean, it can be very different. But again, I think they need each other, to a great degree. And I think there's really sharp and talented people, on both sides. But there is a certain amount of mutual distrust, suspicion, and love too.
When you invite guests to your classroom, and you're interviewing them, and you're approaching, that sort of unlocking of what they know and how they lead in the entertainment industry, and they're speaking to a business school that is at the heart of Silicon Valley, how do you approach that situation? Are you thinking about, how do you translate? How do you think about the questions that you ask and the prep that you do to really get the most out of that time together?
If you want to be prepared, you want to be over prepared. You want to know as much as you possibly know about the speakers, and in teaching students, you want your students to know. But then when I'm doing an interview for a documentary, I try to create an atmosphere which I'm going to get the best possible answers. What exactly does that mean? It means that, the lighting should be right. It should be in a quiet place, the way everyone treats the interview subject. I mean, when you think about life in general, most people don't have real conversations. I mean, it's one of the sad realities. I mean, there are these chilling statistics on how much, parents speak to their children, children speak to their parents, husbands speak to wives, wives to husbands, boyfriends to girlfriends, and so on. So when you do an interview, you're actually breaking that. You're giving someone a chance to be really thoughtful and to go back to moments in their lives that were incredibly meaningful to them, or to be thoughtful about the present time. So this is something that a lot of people actually quite like. Because it's a chance to be introspective without being in a rush situation, which most of us are. And so, like, as an example of this, I remember, I interviewed the great civil rights leader, John Lewis, and he was an extremely busy person. He's, John Lewis is one of the icons of the civil rights movement. I've actually interviewed him a couple of times. And one of the times I interviewed him, we set up to film him in his office and made sure all the lighting was right. The camera person does all the Ken Burns films. It was beautifully lit. And he showed up, and he said, "Oh, look, I know I promised you an hour, but I only have half an hour because I promised the mayor of Atlanta I'd go campaigning with him." And I said, "Look, we'll take whatever we can get." But then, he sat in the chair, and he was at some of the, March on Washington, the Bridge at Selma, where he said some of the really iconic moments of civil rights. And he's telling his stories, and half an hour becomes an hour, becomes an hour and a half, becomes 2 hours. At the end, he's crying, I'm crying, the camera person is crying. I mean, we're all, like, incredibly touched. And, so the interview went probably about 2.5 hours. And then at the end of it, he was, we're all, like, just sort of drained in a way. And at the end of it, he sat around and he was like kind of schmoozing for half an hour, because it was a chance to go back and, it says, oh my God, I got to go out campaigning. So he did. But it was a chance for this incredibly accomplished person to just go back in time and think about those things. So you're trying to create an atmosphere where people feel, comfortable and good about telling their stories. And some of the things which, you asked earlier about interviewing, techniques, is I try to keep it like a conversation, and you try to, you may have, whatever, 20 questions or 30, and they're 1 through 30, sort of forget that. It's you just want to you want to ask those questions, and then what I'll do is during a break I'll speak to an associate producer and I'll say, well, how are we doing here? And they'll say, oh, questions one, 5, 8, 11, they're doing pretty well, but you should go back and get 6 and 7. They weren't as good. So but you want to keep it like a conversation. You want to keep it loose with people, and you want to listen to what the person says. So when they say something, you can pick up on and continue as a conversation. And what you're looking for are meaningful moments for the most part. I mean, this is true in my class as well. You're looking for meaningful, illustrative stories. You're just trying to, you're just trying to create a situation where people will tell memorable stories that are illustrative. It's not general things. You want some degree of specificity that you'll remember. And so that's what I'm looking for in some ways, that, memorable stories. And that, preparing for the class, I try to get my students, I have them read about the speakers, I have them read about, the position, where the industry is at that point. And hopefully, all this adds up to giving them some tools to ask perceptive and illustrative questions. And look, you're a student in my class and you're a great student, and the crowd is a really impressive crowd, and they ask perceptive and illuminating questions. And my technique as a teacher is that, I come there with a sort of a list of questions in my mind, and generally they come out from the speakers. If they don't, then I'll get involved. And that's another point I think I should make about interviewing too. One of the things I think is helpful with interviews is that you have to know what you need to make it all work. Like when I started doing this, I did more foot soldiers than generals. And as I did it more, I started doing more generals. And sometimes you have time restrictions when you're doing that. So I developed this thing where I'll go and interview and I'll say, I have like, half a dozen, 8. I can't leave the room unless I get these questions answered and answered well, and so, so you say, I got to get these. And sometimes if you pre-interviewed somebody and there's a good story in there and they're not telling it as well, you have to circle back. Most of the time, interview subjects like that. If you say, well, I need, can I ask you that again, slightly different way? They like that. But you come in there and you say, I can't do the job I need for my film unless I have these, half dozen or 8 interview questions answered. So those you have to do. And by the way, I think this is a technique that if you're being interviewed is good to have as well. So you say, Ian, you're going to give it being interviewed by somebody. It's good to know that you should have like half a dozen points that you don't want to leave without saying. And hopefully it's in a smooth and good way. But that can be really helpful, because then if you add in all sorts of other stuff, that's fine. But you have said, the 6 or 8 things that you think are really important to express. And so I sometimes think about that with my speakers, because you're torn between two things. On one hand, it's like what they always say about lawyers in court: don't ask a question you don't know the answer to. And on the other hand, it's sometimes the things are completely surprising or completely wonderful. So you have to, in some ways, sometimes they're a little antithetical, but in some ways you have to get both. You have to get the things you know the answer to, but you also have to provide the space where people can do can give you surprising great answers. And that happens when I interview people. It happens all the time. I don't, something comes out which I didn't expect, and it's wonderful. And that happens in my class as well, where people ask really perceptive questions, and you get really interesting stories.
That's awesome. Yeah, I think what really resonated with me was don't screw it up. It sounds to me that it's about sort of like setting the context for someone to tell a really great illustrative story, and just letting that kind of go. Like your example with John Lewis, which is there was some context. He had 30 minutes that turned into 2.5 hours. You talked about pre-interviews. You talked about doing the research. You talked about prep work. Like, what are some of the things ahead of that moment, that preparation? What are some of the 1, 2, or 3 things that you found maybe most effective? Things that you've tried different ways? Is it pre-interviews? Is it setting the context for the audience?
Oh, I think you're trying to pull maybe the wrong word. You're trying to give people the chance to do their best work, and most of the time when, most of the interviews that I do are pretty friendly. I mean, I've done interviews which are not, but overwhelmingly they're friendly interviews, meaning that you're letting people tell their stories. I mean, you're not their publicist, but you're trying to let them tell their stories. They're not, more in the news side of things, there's more antagonism that goes on between interview subject and the interviewer. But in my case, most of the time, you're just letting them tell their stories in as honest and a truthful way as possible. So there has to be some degree of trust too. In this day and age, there are plenty of TV shows where people's sound bites are cobbled together to make them say things they didn't say. and folks are aware of that. So there has to be some level of trust. And I think part of being an effective leader is in anything is you have to give people the space to do their best work. And I don't really think that's much different with an interview. People have to feel comfortable in telling their stories. They have to feel comfortable that, you're going to treat them with respect. You're not going to quote them out of context. And you have to give them the chance to sort of go back in space and time and to think about it. To give you another story, I interviewed a minister named Billy Kyles, who was with Martin Luther King the day he was murdered. And, you know, um, he's told the story of the murder, many times. It has almost like a biblical connotation, the way they tell the story, him and others who were there. And at one point, when he was telling his story, we had a little problem with the lights, and the camera person said, "Oh, can we shut down for a couple of minutes? I got to fix the light." And while he was doing that, the camera person was adjusting the light. Billy Kyles leaned over to me and said, "I can still feel the texture of Martin's tie that day." It's almost like he had gone back, decades to, that terrible afternoon where Martin Luther King was murdered. And so I think that, it was very touching. I said, "Well, when we come back on, can you, get the lights fixed? You can tell a story." And he told the story. It was very touching. So I think you want people to go to that kind of place if they're talking about events that have gone by. If they're talking about current events, you just want them to feel comfortable and that you're giving them the space to talk about, things in a thoughtful and way which is illustrative to your audience and to yourself.
That's perfect. I think so. What I got from that was it's about establishing trust, right? And letting people do their best work. So prepping them. And that could come from, pre-interviews. It could come from sort of side conversations. It's really noticing and unlocking and sort of nudging folks in the right context. Did I get that right?
Yeah, I think so. It's also, you have to set a tone that you're in no rush, like in an unhurried fashion. I mean, most of us are usually pretty busy. I mean, I think that's the reality of, the modern world, that, we're multitasking and up to many things at once. But I think when you do an interview, it has to be, I'm here for you as long as it takes. I mean, I also, direct, fictional works too. And I feel I do that with actors as well. Making a movie is very expensive. I mean, it's expensive by the day. I mean, if you think about the hourly costs, it's chilling. But, and there's actors that get in there and they just, bam, they nail it. You got it. You're moving on to the next shot. But then there's other actors, often people with less experience who are a little nervous. It's having, they have a little trouble doing it. The vibe you have to put out, to my experience, is we have all day. Just don't worry about it. You may have made a mistake in the first couple of takes, but we have all day. Take your time, and just do your best work. And, sometimes it's a little stressful because, in the back of your head, you're thinking, the clock's turning here. And if I don't get this in a requisite number of time, it could affect something down the road here, which I don't want to do. But, the forward-facing thing is to give people the time. And by the way, it's 100% sincere, because when you're giving them the time to do their best work, it's helping you, of course, as a director, and it's helping them, as a performer. And, and those two things together, hopefully will contribute to a better quality of the film. But I can't stress enough, you have to give people the space to do their best work.
A lot of this is around setting the context. So it's setting the space, enabling them to do the best work, trust, really making sure that they're comfortable in the environment.
Yes, I think those things are all true. Yeah. Part of what makes, I think, a good interview is you want it to be like a conversation. You want people to be thoughtful and not just reciting talking points. I don't know if a lot of your audience may or may not know about press junkets where reporters will interview movie stars and, a very short period, it'll be one after another. And they just, the movie stars just say the same thing over and over again. It's just like the talking points, and you don't really want that, even though, they're practiced at it and they can be very smooth at it. You want something that's kind of thoughtful, to it. And, sometimes I would notice when I teach at Stanford where, the crowd of students is just amazing. I would hear my students ask a question and I would say to myself, as the faculty person, wow, that's a good question. And as the question would do, I would see the speaker's eyes just kind of pop a little bit. And, and then they would say, yeah, that's a great question. And it was like, yeah, well, I had the same thought, and so that's what you want. You want people to say, that's a great question. And you want them to ponder it in a way too. And this is, maybe a little bit off the topic, but one of the great things about, teaching in Silicon Valley is there's a real interest. I mean, there's a real interest in people in Hollywood that, what's going on up there. I may not understand it completely, but it's there's something up there that's changing the way the world is, and I'd like to know something about it. And so that's people I think quite enjoy coming to Silicon Valley.
So, and you talked about Silicon Valley and the draw of that, and being in this wonderful institution. At the same time, you're having people speak about stuff that's super interesting things, whether it's in your documentary films and they're going to be on this giant screen in front of all these people pretty publicly, or in a classroom where so many people, these future leaders, are going to be hearing about these stories and these sort of tales from these folks. When you want to draw something out of people, I always think about, like, it almost is easier to do it in a very private setting, and yet you do it in something that's very public and sort of very big. How do you think about navigating that piece?
Well, look, that's the trick. I mean, the trick is to try to take something big and make it small. I mean, I can talk about that in two ways. One way is, as I believe I mentioned before, if you pre-interview someone, you hear a great story, and then when they tell it in the interview that you're doing on camera, it's not as great, that you want to give them the chance to go back and tell the story again. And your audience doesn't really care, if they had to go back or if they stumbled, or, sometimes, especially if you do interviews in New York, you got sirens cutting through and you're asking them to do it a couple of times, even though they're telling the story fine, but you have sirens or whatever it is. An audience doesn't care. All they really care about is what they're listening to. It's sort of like a camera. Like if you go to a movie set, look, depending on the size of the operation, you can have 75, 150 on giant blockbusters, 300 people, or it's called on the call sheet, but it really comes to what's on that frame. Like, you don't care that there's, 150 people standing behind the camera doing all sorts of stuff. What you care about is the frame. So you're trying to create something that is small in a way. And I feel like that's true of storytelling in general. I mean, I feel on some level I've, based my career around this Stalin misquote. And the misquote is that, one death is a tragedy, 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. So this idea that it's hard to get around 1,000,000 deaths. I mean, it's just as important as it is, it's just hard to get around. But if you know one person's story, that can stand in for, many, many people's stories. So that's the idea, that you're trying to, get things to be small in a way. So whether you're doing a film and you're just thinking about what's on frame, or you're doing a class where you want people to just feel like they're having a conversation, that's what we try to do. I mean, partially for that reason, I don't allow recording in the classroom, and I don't allow computers in the classroom. You're trying to make it as sort of private a conversation as you possibly can, because you're just trying to create a comfort area where folks will feel comfortable telling their stories. So if there's a classroom full of people who are on their iPhones, iPads, computers, and so on, then there's a sense, well, maybe what I'm saying, isn't so private. But if, a speaker comes into a classroom and doesn't see that, then then there's more of a sense of comfort. And then, first and foremost, I have just amazing students who ask perceptive and good questions.
And maybe just going on the other side of that conversation, when you think about the guests that you bring in and you think about the profile of the guest, what makes sort of a good guest and sort of extraordinary guest, and then kind of guests that you might want to filter out? Just, I'm asking this because, we're doing a podcast, and I'm just kind of curious about, like, what would be that? Can you identify them before they come in? You just know that they're going to be great?
Yeah, I think that, again, you're looking for people who are going to tell you something that's not on the website. So if you have someone who's head of a streaming network or a studio or whatever, there's plenty of stuff on the website where they'll tell you, what the official line is. You want someone who's you ask them an honest question, you want an honest answer. So that's one thing I really look for. And by the way, I have conversations before people come, and I tell them this. I say, look, I need stuff that's not on the website because the pedagogy of the class is that. And I've had people say to me who said something, I don't feel really comfortable doing that. It's like, they're too nervous, but that's a very small percent. The overwhelming number of people feel comfortable, answering a good question with a good answer. And so that's what you want. You want this kind of honesty. I mean, I think that that sincerity and honesty are very hard to fake in a convincing way. And I think you want people who will give you that honest answer, and even if it's sometimes a little uncomfortable. I mean, one thing I've also found is that before people come to my class, I ask them to if they feel okay about speaking about their failures. I think speaking of failures is a lot more illustrative at times than speaking about success. You know, and they wouldn't be here unless they've had great success. But I think it's often a chance to look back. What did I do wrong that can really offer lessons? And most of the speakers I have feel really comfortable with doing that. I mean, look, they speak for an hour and 15 minutes to, an hour and a half. And, there's a lot of success in there. But also I think it's really informative. Like failures can be informative.
That's awesome. So one of the reasons I'm, this is a great first interview is because I'm trying to figure out for a podcast, how do I do all my prep? How do I not mess it up? If I can get the great guests coming in here, making sure that they're ready and have the expectation to talk about things that aren't on the website, that they're comfortable, speaking and having a space that we establish trust, that we prepare them to do their best work in terms of what they want to share out. And we have to make sure that they're comfortable, being a public podcast, if they want to speak about their failures and be ready. Does that sound sort of right? If I was kind of trying to optimize for the most sort of engaging, valuable podcast?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the business side of things, I mean, sometimes people are restricted a bit by what they can say. But I think most of the time there's, quite a bit of latitude of what you can speak about, especially if you're talking about past lessons, because it's not like we're going to acquire this company. It's almost like we did acquire this company and it didn't work, or it did work for that matter, and, speak to the reasons for it. So I think if, something's going to have, endurance, then I think it's fine, to ask about things that happened in the past. I mean, I listen to this podcast, Fresh Air, which has been on the air for decades, and the host, Terry Gross, she often plays podcasts, interviews that she's done years and years ago. And a lot of it's still very relevant, because you're not talking about what's happening today. It may have been something that took place a decade ago, but the insights are still valuable. So I think you want to give people the chance to really express their insights. And also I think folks often like to talk about, in a business school, like their leadership and, and how they do it. And as extremely well, there's many different styles of leadership. It's not one size fits all. And I've noticed with some of my students, I think sometimes they're searching for what kind of leader are they, and by having a number of styles, that can inform them about what kind of leader. I mean, I should ask you, is that you were a student at the Stanford Graduate School of Business? When you were there, were you asking yourself, what kind of leader am I or will I be?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And I think that was a big, conversation. And I think the faculty in some of the classes really ignited that at the start. They, one of the exercises was doing Myers-Briggs, and you had two classmates, which are extremely accomplished, that were like polar opposites. I've known them for over a decade, and they've all both changed, mellowed out, and but yeah, very accomplished people, extraordinarily different styles is one of the things that we saw over and over again.
Yeah, and I think, by the way, I think you raise a good point about how people change. I mean, one of the class speakers in my class, a very accomplished producer, Nina Jacobson, who did the Hunger Games and many other very impressive things. She was in my class talking about in Hollywood, as you rise up through the ranks, there's kind of the nerd route. The people work extremely hard, cover everything, are just incredibly diligent, and like the cool kid route. And the cool kid route, the people who are going to the parties or socializing, they're making contacts and so on. But if you want to be, kind of at the top and successful in Hollywood, the cool kids have to learn to be a little nerdy, and the nerds have to learn to be like, kind of like cool kids. You sort of need both sides. And I think you have to be open to that as well. And then as faculty members, I think you want to present, in ways some, best practices that, which I think, I teach about the entertainment industry, but, some of the things, I teach and people respond to, I think, apply to any industry. I mean, it's just like, have the ability to say, I am wrong or I was wrong in exactly those words. I think that's something that applies to, I think, any industry, and people who respect you for that. And I think there's just a number of these things where if you can give illustrative examples of, this sort of thing, then folks can say, oh, that's, seems like a pretty good strategy, or that's what you hope to.
No, that's excellent. That's thank you for sharing that, because I feel like that's kind of the purpose of this podcast, this Tools for Tech Leaders, is that we're not going to use all the tools all the time. So, and one of the tools I can share from leaders, and and what works for them. Ed Catmull had this book called Creativity Inc. And in that book, he talked about these mindsets. And he's like, look, think of this as like you're putting on a sweater, right? The sweater might fit, it might not fit, but like, here's your choices. So these concept of mindsets are not like principles or company values. They're just kind of like, hey, see if this tool set, is that a crescent wrench or is that like, a screwdriver? You can use those in different cases. So I think that is, thank you for that. I think this is going to be one of the themes of this podcast.
Well, by the way, Creativity Inc., I think, is just a truly amazing book. And I assign it to my students and have done it for a while. Books tend to get outdated very quickly. Magazine and newspaper articles are much fresher. In fact, just this morning, I was copying a Wall Street Journal piece, which I'll be using in my spring class. I mean, it was about something breaking just today. So yeah, but I do use that book. That book endures, because I think the lessons are really valuable. One of my students, who's the CEO of a game company, invited me to lunch one day, and I was walking through his office, and I saw seemed like every desk had a copy of that, and I said, "Wow, the people must really love it." I said, "Well, when we hire them, we give them the book." But anyway, it's a good book. By the way, I completely agree with doing it. I've also had some of the absolute top executives in Hollywood say, if there's one book, or I read this book, that's the book. So. Very glad to hear you're reading that book. Yeah, I think you want to give people a chance, again, to do their best work. And there's another story which I think really illustrates executives that I've seen who are really impressive. I've done a number of films for HBO, and I did a film, and when I was screening it in a rough cut stage for my executive at HBO, there was one woman we interviewed who she didn't particularly think worked in the film, and she said, "I think you should cut her out." And I said to her, "So yeah, my wife feels the same way." And then we went back to editing, and as I looked at it, I thought, something, I want to keep her. So anyway, I kept the woman in the film, and then the film, we had some screens, premiered on HBO. They were happy with the film, but I was at a screening a couple of months later, and I'm watching, and I'm saying, something, my executive was right. I should have cut that woman out. Anyway, so I called her up afterwards, after the screening, and I said, hey, I was wrong. I should have listened to you and cut that woman out. And her answer to me, which I thought was great, was, "You should have listened to your wife." Which, by the way, she could have said, "You should have listened to me." But in any event, that was what she said. I said, "Yeah, but you're my boss. Like, why didn't you make me cut it out?" She said, "Well, sometimes you have to let the filmmakers make their films." And, that's why people love HBO, because you're given the opportunity to kind of make your films. I mean, believe me, I've worked for a number of other people would be, glad you want to keep her, Bill, cut her out. And the people will just give you a dictate. But in HBO, I think the feeling was, well, this will be, a pretty good film no matter what, whether she's in or out, but let the filmmaker make their film. And I think you want to give people the opportunity, to do their best work in a way. And I feel like I learned that, from her. I mean, look, as a director, you're, for lack of a better word, you're the boss, so you can get input from all sorts of places, but you make the final call. But I think there's many times that you have to listen to the people you're working with in a really thoughtful and measured way. And when you've brought people onto your team that you respect and they're pushing back against you, then I think it's important to listen to them. Most of the time, if someone you really respect, who you're working with, is pushing back in a major way, there's usually a pretty good reason. And most of the time, you should do what they said. Look, another example. I mean, my boss for a while was Dick Wolf, who was probably the most successful producer in the history of television. And I've been around Dick when people say, "Dick, I completely disagree with you." And Dick is okay with that. You should have your reasons. But I think a good leader is okay, no matter how much success you've had, if someone says, "I completely disagree with you." Not everyone's like that. So I think, again, you have to listen to the people around you and really take their what they say to you, to heart in a major way.
Thank you. That's definitely a theme in management overall. Just like when do you when do you have the autonomy and when do you have that sort of central control? And it seems like it sounds like in the entertainment industry, there's a range, and HBO is on sort of the max of let filmmakers make their film.
Well, I think that, like many leaders, I mean, you're a leader, of course, all day long when you're a director, you're being asked questions like this dress or that dress, this gun or that gun. Do you stop at, 4 or 5 takes, or is the scene so important if you feel like you're going 6 or 7 or 8 or more takes, then that's, you should do that, but it may be expense, it's something else. So, it's how do you manage your time and how do you manage, the input that you're getting from the folks who you're working with. And if you think about it, making a film and a startup are really quite similar. Like, what are the elements of like a startup, right? You need a good idea, you need a good team, you need some funding, and you need to, produce something that folks are interested in, right? Well, what's a movie or a TV show, right? You need a good idea, you need a good team, you need some funding, and you need to produce something that folks want to watch. So I think there are a lot of similarities. In some ways, I think it's what makes it so exciting because you're starting at this place where, there might not be anything there, but you're building it up. And if I could also add one thing about being in Silicon Valley, one of the great things about being in Silicon Valley, as opposed to some other places, is people come up with ideas that can be unusual or would be shot down or be considered unfundable in other situations. And I think that Silicon Valley is more of a place where people don't dismiss it and they'll say, well, let me think about this. Maybe we can get it to work. And I've heard this from so many people who, have moved to Silicon Valley, that the culture of being more open to ideas that seem a little unusual is prevalent here. And I think that's a really valuable thing. And I think as a leader, I think you want to be that person, that you want to give consideration to something that may not be completely standard, and think, well, maybe it's not so crazy. Maybe there's something here.
Thank you. That's perfect. One of our first institutional investor was an investor called Y Combinator, and their motto is make something people want. And I think that applies both to startups and to film.
Yeah, that's great. Well, Y Combinator is an incredibly impressive track record. So obviously they invested in you, which was a very wise move on their part.
You're a Stanford professor. You've brought a lot of great leaders in. If you're just sort of pitch what it meant to be on a podcast that's Tools for Tech Leaders, this concept of there's all these people out there, they're trying to figure out their leadership style. We're trying to put together these little toolkits, as Ed Catmull would say, these mindsets for them to pick and choose among. If that's the kind of the goal that we got, what are your thoughts on how I might go and approach these potential speakers and sort of package it up? And, what would be the sort of packaging and the messaging or a draft of the packaging messaging that I might use?
Well, I think that, look, I believe you should appeal to people's better angels. So I think people appreciate the opportunity to share, things that they've learned, something they've learned the hard way, and they want to help folks out. I mean, I really do. Not to sound too Pollyannish, but I do feel like people want to help. I mean, when I first started teaching at Stanford, we were, for one of my classes is speaker-based, one's largely me speaking. But on the speaker-based course, after the first year that, I co-taught the course, I remember saying to myself, we had some really good guests, but I don't know, is it going to be tough next year? Because, I thought there might be people, they just wanted sort of Stanford bragging rights. I spoke at Stanford. You don't really get any extra points by speaking 2 years as opposed to one. And then what I learned is that people like coming. So virtually everyone who comes to my class comes back. And these are often really busy people because I think they like interacting with students and they like sharing the things that they have learned. And I think you can appeal to people, like that. I mean, we all walk around with lessons and sometimes they seem like really small things, but they can be, illustrative, to other folks. I mean, I can just give you one example, is that in a film that I did, which was produced by Chuck Roven, who's one of the all-time great producers in Hollywood. This year he has Oppenheimer and he has many, many very, very impressive films, Batman and Wonder Woman and lots of really impressive films under his belt. And Chuck and I disagreed about one line that was in a dramatic feature I did. And Chuck kept saying, Bill, that line's not funny. You think it's funny. It's not funny. I said, I don't know, Chuck. I think it's funny. And went back and forth like this a number of times. And so, well, let's screen and see what happens. We had test screening and there was a laugh. And at the end of the test screening, I came outside on the Warner Brothers lot, and the very first thing that Chuck said was, the line stays. And so, it was, I mean, we changed lots of stuff. I mean, it's a collaborative process. But the fact is that Chuck was outrageously successful, much more experienced than me, and can see right away the line stays. And I kind of feel like, it's a lesson that, I can share with people as well. You have to listen to an audience, and you have to be prepared to change your mind. Yeah, I wouldn't be shy about like asking people to think about tools that they use. I mean, I think it's a really good idea. I mean, I sometimes think about one of my good friends who teaches writing at the GSB named Glenn Cramen. I mean, he always tells his students that, you want to be, one in a million and not one of a million. And it's a really good line. And I hear my students talk about it because something about it resonates. And I think you're looking for things in a film or an interview. You're looking for things that resonate and that can be helpful to folks, And I think that, most of the folks I know who are teaching, are doing it for all the right reasons, and they're doing it to really help folks get ahead and impart knowledge and everything you want a teacher to be. And I think that when you're appealing to people and giving them a chance to do it, it's a wonderful opportunity, and I think folks will come on board and do it.
Thank you, Bill. That's a fantastic place to end on. I think maybe I'll change the title of the podcast. Maybe it's mindsets for tech leaders, and we can use these tools. Tools and this concept from Ed Catmull and put something together that people can sort of pick and choose the things that they keep. Thank you so much, Bill. This has been absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much for listening to our conversation with Bill Guttentag today. I learned a lot. I hope you did too. Please consider subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your subscription feeds.